Now let's add some lighting to this scene. So we're gonna start, this is a object in which we have created a shelf, so let's call that shelf. And now we should have a room, so we're simply going to add the wall of a room, but let's call that room. And instead we are not going to create a box, we're going to remove that one, but we're going to have a plane. And I could scale it up, but what I really want is to have the same pivot at the back of the shelf, same pivot as the boxes. So I'm going to rescale the size, and I'm going to add a transform node. And when I scale it here, I want to make sure that we have that pivot on the z-axis. So now whenever I scale it, it will go that way. And I can make it much larger, and I will have the same thing for the vertical plane. So I'm going to have that face not the y-axis but the z-axis, and I want to offset it on the y-axis here. I'm going to make that bigger, and I'm going to merge both of those planes. Now those are the lights that are currently in the scene, but they are not giving very good results. So we're going to change the lights, but we're also going to change the materials on those objects. But first, let's go with the lights. So we're going to create a direct light, and instead of moving it manually, I want to use a polar transform, which is really a convenient way to move things like lights. So let's still display the helper of the light, and as I move it, here I can see the light is pointing down, so I need to rotate it to make sure it's facing the z-axis like this, 90 degrees. And now as I move it on the polar transform, I can change the latitude and the longitude, and it will always face this center point, which I can also move. So now let's delete those two lights, and let's move this one slightly to the left and have its shadow size increase, so it really goes around the whole scene. And let's add another light that will be from a different angle, like this. So now the shadows are looking pretty terrible, so let's change the materials on those objects. So we're going to create a material network, I'm going to call it matte, and we're going to use a standard material. So I'm going to create two of those, one for the room and one for the shelf. And I'm going to use both of them. I'm going to assign both of them. So this is the room and this is the shelf. So now things are a little nicer, but let's still tweak those materials. On both of them, I want to turn down the metalness and turn up the roughness. Now we have those very dark edges regarding the lights, and what we could change is the bias on those shadows. We could reduce that to 0. It will look a little nicer. Now what we still have is we have very strong shadows, and one way to improve that, there are many ways to improve shadows, but the way we're going to look at is actually using a different material. So in the equivalent material of the mesh standard, we have the mesh standard builder, which gives you more options, and one of them is the shadow PSS, which is what we're going to use. So we're going to switch to those materials, and we're going to assign them again. Standard shelf. So we're going to change again the same metalness to 0 roughness to 1, metalness to 0, and roughness to 1. And now if we look at the room, let's activate this PSS shadow. So suddenly we have this very flickery light, and so let's simply reduce the filter size and maybe increase the sample count. And we can do the same thing on that light, on that material, on the shelf material. 32, and we had 0.2. So now we have much softer shadows, which is nicer to look at. And now we can, if we save the scene, let's see what we are looking at in here, and we reload that page. So now that's looking much better, but we should really hide those lights. And we're gonna hide, so we're gonna untoggle the show helper. And also we're going to hide the control helper here, like this. So now it's looking nice, but I don't want to see those edges, so we're going to find a way to have the room disappear or fade off on the edges. So the way we're going to do that is to, if we go inside this node, we actually have some controls such as the alpha, and we're going to basically tweak the alpha. We could tweak the alpha on that level, but it really just tweaks the whole thing. So what we're going to use is we're going to use the alpha, we're going to have the alpha affected by the position. So for instance, if we have vector3 to float, and if we have the X affecting the alpha, and we make sure to toggle transparent on, you can see that if it's below 1, it starts to fade out. And so we're going to use that system, but we're going to use it so that it has a distance to this vertical axis. And so for that, we're going to use a disk node, and the disk is going to give us a radius from a specific position, and that position is going to be basically 0, 0 on the X and Z axis. So if we ignore the Y axis for now, so we're going to float to vector, we're only going to take the X and Z axis, and we're going to take that position here, like that. And if we put that into the alpha, now we start to only see this bit. So we can always change the radius and also change the feather. So it's a bit of a smoother transition. So that sort of works, but it would be nice to have the radius change depending if it's on X or if it's on Z. So what we can do is simply do a mult add on the X, and we're going to divide this by a specific value. So that's more or less what I'm trying to achieve. Now this transition in the feather is not ideal, so I'm going to add some easing here. And the default value scene in, scene out gives us something interesting, but I get slightly more interesting with it with a different, we can try different things. Quadratic in and out is okay. And now that works well, but we still have the top to worry about. And in that case, we're going to use the same technique, but not in X and Z, but in X and Y. So we're going to do the same thing. We copy that, and we're going to use X and Y. So if we use X and Y like this, now we have this circle here. So we need to add things on Y. We're going to remove so that it goes higher. And we're actually going to increase the height of the room. So we go higher here, and we also divide the same. Basically, we want to divide the same value that we have here using it to divide the x. So we're going to create a constant, and whatever value here, I'm going to copy paste it. So that is in the mult, and we also want that in the mult. So now we have this, the same elongated circle that we have at that position. And now we want to use both masks. We want to use this mask up to the distance where that other mask starts, and that is this value. So I'm going to create again a constant, minus 24. I'm going to keep it positive here. I'm going to negate it so that it goes here, not in the mult, in the add. Can remove this. And now I want to say when we are under this value, when the y position is under this value, we use this mask. When it's above, we use that mask. So I'm going to compare this value. I'm going to compare the y of the position to this value, and if it's less than, then I'm going to use a two-way switch. If it's less than, we're going to use this one, and if it's more, we're going to use that one. And now if we put this here, we should have the mask that we are after, and from there we can switch, we can tweak the feather width to have even bigger transition. So now if we save the scene and if we load it here, we have a mask that is around our 3D scene and does not, the transition between the 3D scene and the HTML part is invisible.